Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people who may be watching for the first time. We also have people watching on Facebook and some who listen to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio. In Melbourne, that's at FM 88, or everywhere else on computer, it's j-air.com.au. So welcome to everybody there. My name is Alan Freedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, and our guest for tonight, Katherine Deves, a lawyer and former political candidate and a vocal commentator on transgender issues. The format will be as usual. We're going to have an interview discussion, firstly with Katherine for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And as I always remind people, if you want to ask a question, we do ask you to raise your hand electronically. We need to do that so that we can see that you're in the line, because we need to give you authority to unmute yourself. So please raise your hand anytime if you want to ask a question. Written questions can be placed on the chat function. Robert Gregory, our Director of Public Affairs, he may be a little late tonight, but if we can, we'll read out some of them during question time. Now, this week, we're going to depart a little from our usual focus on Israel and the Jewish world, and instead are going to take a look at one of the woke issues that is very prevalent these days, that of gender politics in Australia. However, we will touch on aspects that do have a connection to Jewish issues. One of the people prominent in the debate in this country is Katherine Deves, a lawyer and former political candidate for the Liberal Party at the last federal election. One of her areas of concern is that of transgender women in sport, that is, men who have transitioned or are transitioning to be women and who then compete with an unfair physical advantage against people who were born female. And all this is doing my head in. To discuss it all, we're delighted to have Katherine join us tonight. Katherine, thanks for your time and welcome to the AJA. Just to set the scene, could you firstly tell us a little bit about your professional life and why you wanted to get into politics?
Well, thank you so much for having me with you this evening. It's great to be here. So as you said before, I'm a mother of three daughters, a long-term partner of David, who's the father of my girls. I'm a lawyer and I have a background in sales and marketing in the wine and spirits industry. My partner, David, he's also a small business owner, a tradesman, so we understand the challenges of running your own business. And I put my hand up to enter politics. I have history within my family. My great-grandfather was the youngest senator in the first federal parliament. He came from Tasmania. He was very active in the constitutional law debates to write our constitution, and he was one of the founding members of what then became the Liberal Party. So I had tried to join the Liberal Party a few times in my adult life, but children life got in the way. And then finally, when my little one went off to kindergarten, I decided to rejoin. And I was attending the Women's Liberal Council meetings, and they kept asking women to put their hand up. And I'm in the electorate of Warringah, and we have an independent here by the name of Zali Stegel. And I felt that with her being an independent, she really wasn't able to get things done. She's not at the seat of the government's table. She's able to sort of raise awareness of issues, but ultimately she doesn't hold power in the parliament. So as they continue to ask women to put their hand up, I decided to do so. And to my very great surprise, I was chosen over two other candidates. They were males who were in the area, who were members of the Liberal Party, who had been there for a lot longer than I had. So it was a bit of a shock to actually be chosen. And then obviously the campaign started, and, things transpired as most people probably saw in the media.
Yeah. And these two other guys that you were competing against, were they novices like you were in politics, or had they had political experience?
No, not really. Like, they'd been members of the party for a long time. One of them had sat on one of the policy groups, One man, David Brady, he had congenital deafness, so he was a disability advocate and worked in that area. The other one was working with respect to, I think he was working on a military publication.
Okay. All right. I'm going to hand you over to David, who needs to unmute himself, and he'll start the discussion on tonight's topic.
Okay. Look, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Catherine. I'm just going to take us through a security procedure before we get stuck into the issues. So I'm going to mute everyone, and then Catherine and Alan, can you unmute yourselves now, please? And make sure that you're back with us. Catherine looks back with us. That's the one we need. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask Catherine some specific questions, but I want to set a Jewish context, and I'm going to share with you a couple of things, because I'm sure Catherine is an expert on the issues, but probably doesn't claim any expertise on the Jewish perspective or Israel. So the first thing I'm going to show you is part of the Torah. The translation comes from Chabad.org. It's Devarim 22.5, and it talks about a man shall not wear the garment of a woman, or vice versa. So it seems the commentary expounds on this, that that particular negative mitzvah exists because it's to prevent moral degradation in a society. That's the sort of direction of the commentary. The Jewish value is to affirm gender identity, I guess the opposite of gender fluidity. Now, is that having any impact in the Jewish world today? Well, yes, I'm just going to show you something that is in the Israeli press in the last 24 hours, and that is Israel is joining the drag queen story time issue for young children. And this, as you can see, is Israel National News, Aretz Sheva, and there's a controversy about this being done for 3 to 5 year old. Within our own community in Australia, I guess one area where I was surprised was, many of you, I'm sure everyone's heard of the Australian Union of Jewish Students, AUJS, which represents the youth on university campuses. And I'll just find the right item that can go. Okay. And you would have thought that their priority on university campuses might be fighting anti-Semitism, might be Israel advocacy. That you all just have recently established a new division. And here it is, or just queer. And as you can see, AUJS is a place for a space for queer Jewish students and allies, whatever that means. So this is flowing through to the Jewish community big time. So Catherine, over to you. I've got a few specific questions, but I've got to ask you the tough one, and it's really, really tough because even the Chief Medical Officer of Australia struggled to answer, what is a woman?
A woman is an adult human female. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Now, as someone who has the great disadvantage of a medical degree, I could add that it's characterised by XX sex chromosomes. You can't change your DNA. That if you have XY, you're a male. If you're an XX, you're a female. But it seems to be creating a great deal of difficulty. Now, tell me how you got into the women's sport issue, because you're a co-founder of a movement about defending women's sport?
So I had been following this debate online for a few years. I had started following it when I had my third daughter, and I thought I'd better go brush up on my feminism. And to my very great surprise, I found that the feminism, I'd studied years and years ago, it had morphed into something completely different. So it was all, a lot of pro sex work, pro prostitution, pro sex positivity. Everything was about, if you're a woman and you've made a choice, it's empowering because you're female and you're a feminist. And I just thought, well, that actually doesn't really apply to a whole lot of things. It's not doing any structural analysis. It's not taking into account, the class analysis or anything. So I looked into it further, and I realized that there was an issue going on with males declaring themselves to be women or claiming to be trans, who are then intruding into women's spaces. And one of those areas of life that they're intruding into is sport. And I saw that the AHRC, which is the Australian Human Rights Commission, in conjunction with Sport Australia, had put out some guidelines in June 2019 that effectively destroyed the biological sex categories for sport. It was all now to do with a declared gender identity. And that extends not just from competing in sport, but also to facilities, so change rooms, dormitories, etc. If you're going to go away for the weekend, it extended to that person declaring trans having privacy, and anyone raising concerns or asking questions, even if it's your daughter being sent away on a netball camp for the weekend, and you are aware that there's an 18-year-old male on her team and you ask questions, it'll be you and your daughter who'll be asked to leave. That's the way the policy is written. So that had happened. And then there was a group called Pride in Sport. They're a function of a group called ACON, which is the Australian AIDS Council of New South Wales. They are heavily government subsidised. And as the AIDS crisis is no longer a crisis, they were pivoting to other social justice issues to promote. And one of them is trans rights. And they have a particular division that's focusing on what they call Pride in Sport, which is lobbying every single sports organisation, federation in Australia to adopt this new policy where gender identity overrides biological sex. And I realised that there was no sort of organised resistance to that. There were a few lone voices of female athletes who were speaking up, but they would tend to speak up and then they would get so heavily criticised, they'd just retreat. And my three daughters play a variety of sports between them. The way that I'm intending to navigate their way through teenagehood is to keep them as busy as possible with sports and community events around sports. So I thought to myself, well, if no one's going to speak up, then who's going to speak for my daughters? I felt it was time someone stuck their head over the parapet. So I reached out to Senator Claire Chandler, who was one of the few people in the government who were even discussing this. And then she put me in touch with some women in New Zealand who are already advocating for women, and we created Save Women's Sports Australasia. So that's how it started.
Okay, and some of the sports administrators seem to have taken it on board. I think swimming has recently, sort of recognised the integrity of the competition from a biological perspective, hasn't it?
It has. FINA came out with a fantastic decision. This was actually written by a retired Australian judge called Annabelle Bennett. She was one of the chief people on the when you had the athlete Caster Semenya, who is from Africa, a middle distance runner. This Caster actually has a DSD, a disorder of sex development, which means that Caster is actually biologically male. So Caster was continuously beating the women in this race, and they were restricted based on their DSD from competing in that event. So they went to the court of the International Court of Sports Arbitration, and the main tribunal member was Annabelle Bennett, and she wrote against Caster being able to compete. So if anybody is the foremost legal expert, it will be Annabelle Bennett. So she wrote the FINA policy. There've been a few other sports that have come out in defence of women, but some of them have been truly awful. Surfing and rowing spring to mind, where it is just open slather. So all a male has to do is just say that he identifies as a woman. There's no hormones, there's no surgery, there's no even diagnosis of gender dysphoria. He just has to tick the female box and he can compete.
Okay. So I want to go a little bit more along your story, Katherine. You became a candidate in the federal election for the seat of Warringah. You were known for your stance on these issues. And what happened in the media generally? There was a sort of a pylon, I guess, against you. Can you say a little about what happened?
Sure. So I was known for the sports issue, but on social media and on other podcasts that I'd been interviewed on, I was talking about the issue of gender identity more broadly and how it was impacting children in a medical way, how it was infiltrating, education, government departments, and so on. So I had discussed that, on Twitter, on Facebook, and in my own name, because there were a lot of people who were afraid to speak up. So I did it in my own name. And when I was selected as the candidate, you are advised to take your social media down. So that is what I did. But there was a hacker by the name of Travis Brown, based in Berlin, who had set up a bot to capture my tweets. He put them into a file called and uploaded them to a website called GitHub. So Travis actually was working on the Twitter open source project. The journalists who obtained that file, we don't know whether they just found it or whether it was actually provided to them. So those journalists took all those tweets and they basically just published them everywhere. They decontextualized them, and they took the language that was the most, I suppose, shocking, and turned that into the headline. And I was, I suppose, suffered a social media pylon. But it was interesting. It was mostly for the language that I used. And I do agree that sometimes it was quite confronting and maybe it was a little intemperate or a little bit clumsy, but they couldn't pursue me for the facts of what I was saying, because what I was saying, I was speaking to facts. So the language might have been offensive, but the story behind all those facts, I could have backed it up with evidence. But obviously, some people in the media, they saw me as a threat. So they were just prepared to go after me in any way they could to get me to be disendorsed or for me to back off, which I wasn't going to do. After the initial several days, which were, I will admit, really shocking and took a quite heavy personal toll and on my family, I told them to leave Sydney. And there were, threats of all kinds and just trash talk all over social media. But I don't like bullies. And I thought to myself, I'm speaking to facts. And I find it quite telling that no journalists are really going after the substance of what I'm saying. They're just concentrating on the language that I used. I thought to myself, the real story here is the arguments that I was trying to prosecute. And I also thought, well, I'm also the Liberal candidate, and I'm not solely standing on a platform just highlighting women's rights and child safeguarding. I'm the Liberal candidate. I'd like to stand for an opportunity to represent Warringah, but the media took that opportunity away from me to talk about any other policy issues or issues confronting the people in this electorate.
Katherine, it wasn't just the media. And I know that some of the threats that you received were physical harm to you and your children. So that's about the worst of the worst. But within the Liberal Party itself, there were some who I'll use the word keen to see that you didn't progress, and that harming your political aspirations was more important than teamwork during a campaign. How did you feel about elements within the Liberal Party turning on you?
Well, Winston Churchill said that your opponent is in front of you and your enemies sit behind you. And I think he was quite right. But I think that some of the people within my party who disagreed with what I said, they simply don't understand the issue. They really don't, because many of us on that issue have only been told one version, and that's been promoted, and the ABC has been complicit, as has SBS. There's been, up until, you know, the last year or so, there's been almost no criticism. So many people don't even understand that there are issues with medicalising children. We do now. Things have changed. You know, they see excluding a man who declares himself to be trans out of a women's sport. That's unkind, and you're not being inclusive, and so on. So I think that it was a level of ignorance and also virtue signalling, because they don't understand that mainstream Australia, you know, they agree with what I'm saying. So they're just listening to their friends in the inner city woke elite electorates who want to talk about diversity, inclusion and equality. And they aren't willing to consider that these policies might have an impact on someone. I mean, you were referring before to what's happening over in Israel. And like, with respect to the sport, I mean, I understand there are women of Jewish faith who, you know, they cannot be in the presence of a man who's not their husband, and they certainly can't compete in sport or get undressed in the change room. So if there's a person identifying as a woman who comes into those spaces, suddenly she has to exclude herself. So when they talk about inclusion, you're actually excluding others. But because it's quite a complicated, nuanced argument, I just don't think that my detractors in the party really knew what they were talking about, to be honest.
Well, let's talk about children a bit, because my experience is that most people, you know, don't mind what consenting adults do and how an adult lives his life. But we're seeing more and more in the schools, and I'm going to show the group one last image. Now, you might think that there's just LGBT, but here we have LGGB, TTT, IQQ, AAPP, and I would challenge anyone who didn't read the fine print to be able to translate that. But I'll just draw attention that this is a inclusiveness training directed to elementary teachers. In other words, teachers of young children. So what do you see happening in our schools? And there seems to me to be little political enthusiasm, apart from a few isolated individuals, for defending children. I mean, what's your view?
Yes, there is a proliferation of radical gender theory in schools, and it is based on that idea that you can change your sex with hormones and surgery, and that your identity should supersede the reality of your human sex. It's trying to override, you know, what we're actually experiencing as human beings with whatever construct you create online with your avatar and your persona and so on. And as you pointed out with Drag Queen Storytime, they're targeting children who are younger and younger. In my view, the ideology, I mean, this is an ideology, effectively. It is almost cult-like in the way that it operates. I almost see it as a secular religion. It's now the state-sponsored secular religion, you know, except it has no God. The God is either the state or a person's identity. And, you know, when you believe in something that's so narcissistic and just, it's very small, it's very limiting. You're not believing in something bigger than yourself, or in your community or in God or in family. I think that it's going to be doing real damage to children, where we see sort of traditional organized religions that are on the decline in Western nations. And it seems like identity is now filling that gap. So we see it all through schools, we see it through university, and they're obviously targeting the children because children will believe you. They will believe what you say. So there's also breaking down of safeguards. So we're seeing children being exposed to really inappropriate sexualized content under sort of diversity and inclusion training, or, you know, sex ed, that's really, really inappropriate. And anyone who sort of raises concerns teachers, parents, what have you, they often suffer smearing and vitriolic abuse, and people are afraid to speak up. So you have to wonder about a movement that's seeking to expose children to inappropriate sexualized content, smear anyone who raises concerns. I mean, what's the end point here? I'm really concerned about what's happening.
I saw a very clever line about the drag queen shows. Ask not why young children are taken to drag queens, ask why drag queens want an audience of young children. It's a very interesting question to flip around. Now, just two last things before we open for question time. One is, I guess, a political issue live at the moment. There is a law reform process for the Religious Discrimination Act that potentially has an impact on religious schools, on faith schools. Can you comment on your perspective of what's happening there?
Well, again, I just think this is the state trying to intrude upon what values people want to instill into their children. And I find it extraordinary that something like gender identity has more protection under Commonwealth law than religious belief. And with Scott Morrison's religious anti-discrimination bill, I did think there was a few problems with it. But I think the fact that we had 5 members of the party cross the floor at the 11th hour to defeat the bill was an absolute disgrace. We need to have anti-discrimination law around religion that protects religious belief, and also freedom from religion and belief. But when in looking at what's happening with education at the moment, I mean, the Australian Law Reform Commission, they overstepped the terms of reference from the government because they want to be telling you, who these schools can employ. And I would have thought that someone who either practices the faith or has respect for the faith should be employed over and above someone who disagrees or is critical of it. I mean, if you don't like that particular faith, then you should send your children to a different school. I mean, we're a multicultural enough society. There are enough schools out there that not everything is going to be for everyone all the time. So I actually object to what they're doing. I think that faith-based schools should be allowed to hire who they want. And also with respect to students, when the discrimination bill fell down and those 5 people across the floor, they said it was to protect trans students. But I think it was quite a muddled argument, because if you've got kids at school and they're identifying as the opposite sex, if it's a mixed sex school, it doesn't matter. If it's a girls' school and it's girls starting to identify as a boy, that's fine. She should stay in the girls' school and vice versa. But if you've got a boy identifying as a girl and he wants to go to a girls' school, but it's a single-sex school, then he should not be allowed to go because of his biological sex. But alternatively, he can go to the boys' school. But what these people crossing the floor want to do is open up the single-sex schools to whoever wants to identify as that. And I fundamentally disagree with that.
Yeah. I saw a Christian leader last night on television put it very well, that a school may wish to develop what he calls a faith community. So it's not just about what's written on the chalkboards in front of the students. It's the whole ethos and environment in which the school conducts itself. Now, just finish up on a personal note for you. You have been given a sort of a commentary role on Sky News quite regularly, which has made you reasonably well known and gives you a platform. Do you see realistically a pathway for yourself in politics? Is that still an objective, and do you think there's a reasonable chance of it happening?
Well, I've had a magnificent opportunity with Sky, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. And in my view, it's a great honour to be selected to run as a candidate. And even though I was subjected to what happened to me in the campaign, I had a huge outpouring of support, because when you stand for something, when you have conviction for something, yes, you will absolutely get your detractors, but you will very much garner support. And people from all over the world, all over the country supported me. And I think, you know, it is a mainstream view. So I think over time that will eventually rectify as people become aware of the harms and maybe policies are wound back or laws put in place to actually protect women and girls and families, etc. I'm still a member of the Liberal Party, and I wouldn't say no to any opportunity that arose. I do think for me, probably the Senate would be a better better place to be seated, because you know, you've got border appeal, you've got a much bigger geographical area, whereas I think maybe in an inner city electorate like Warringah, I think Zali Steggall's probably here for a while, so I wouldn't want to contest her again. So I would look to the Senate.
Okay. Alan, back to you.
Okay. Well, we'll go to questions in a moment. Katherine, just a couple from me. The Liberal Party, a lot of people are concerned that it's no longer representing true conservative values. What do you think about that?
I would agree with them. I think I know there are still a lot of people within the party who do hold those traditional values, but we've always sort of had that tension between like the moderates and the conservatives. And right now, sort of progressivism is in the zeitgeist. But I would say that there is a place for those traditional values. And I expect to see, like with Labor, Greens, Teal in government right now, we can see that they are pushing the most extreme versions of leftist Marxist policies at the moment. And I think there will eventually be a bit of a backlash or a sort of self-correction. So the Liberal Party just has to stand firm. They have to go back to their traditional, you know, Menzian values and what they stood for, you know, family, small business, that kind of thing, and be ready to jump on board when the zeitgeist sort of corrects itself. So I think definitely the support is there, but at the moment, I mean, we got defeated soundly at the election, so we've got a bit of time to get our act together federally.
Yeah, and it just seems to me that perhaps we might need a generational shift. Do you think when the current crop of senior people in the party who seem to think that the best way to win office is to mirror what the Labor Party is doing, do you think we need to wait until there's this generational shift before we actually see some change? Because I'm actually quite concerned that we don't have a home for conservative people with conservative values, and there's a lot of them out there.
Well, I don't understand why they are trying to capture votes from people who are never going to vote Liberal. But one thing that gives me a lot of heart is that there's a lot of young people within the conservative movement. So whether it's something like CPAC or the Australian Monarchist League, because they are seeing what's happening with this sort of untethering from, you know, even religion. I mean, that used to give people a sense of community, you know, something to believe in other than themselves. And when we see that that's sort of been on the decline, now you've got all these young people who are actually looking for maybe what their grandparents had. And you'll see with the younger generation, you know, more of them are getting married and things like that. So I think there will be a correction, absolutely, and it will come from the younger generation coming through right now.
And just one more thing from me. We've seen this march of the left through the institutions, and it seems to me that the education system is really the problem area, because we've had left-wing curriculums for probably 20 or 30 years. The kids that went through those schools have grown up, and they're now the teachers of the next generation. So we've really got a problem to get this concept of traditional values back into people's minds. I don't know how that's going to happen, and I wonder if you've had any thoughts about that.
Well, when we look at the results with reading and writing and so on. And we see that Australia, which is, one of the best countries in the world, that we're in the decline. I think there'll have to be a reckoning. So when we see all these syllabuses that are just infested with ideology, whether it's gender or race or climate or what have you, instead of just teaching the basics, I think there will have to be a reckoning at some point.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll go to questions. Just before we do, David's going to play a short commercial and then tell us what's happening next week. And then it's over to you guys on the floor. Over to you, David.
Okay, here comes the commercial, which is for our Israel trip coming up shortly.
Hi, everyone. This is Alan Friedman from the Australian Jewish Association. I just want to remind you about our mission to Israel later this year. It kicks off on Wednesday, the 3rd of May, and for 8 days you will be treated to a range of sites, information and lectures on the politics of Israel, but definitely not from a left-wing perspective. We are inviting you to join the AJA team of David Adler, Robert Gregory and myself for an all-inclusive tour of Israel that promises many unique and exciting experiences. You can find all the details on the webpage, so if you are looking for something special to do later this year, we would be delighted to have you join us. Please visit the mission link for further information. Okay, that's coming up, folks, so please give it some serious consideration. Okay, David, tell us what's happening next week.
Okay, let me just...
When he turns his computer back.
Look, there are half a dozen things going on behind the screen that people don't see, and we don't have special producers and panel operators like Sky. We do it all ourselves.
No.
Okay, so very briefly, if you're not yet actively reporting AJA at the end of this event, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au. Make sure you take out a membership if you're not yet a member, or make a donation. And next week, we are focusing fully on Israel. We have Joseph Gutnick joining us to talk about Israeli politics. He is very close to Likud and Bibi Netanyahu. Amongst the Australian political activists, he's probably the most connected with the politics in Israel. So we will have the privilege of hearing from him directly next week.
Okay, thanks, David. Right, over to you. I've got Joseph, Jeff, Anne, Anne and Debbie. So we'll start with you, Joseph. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Right. Am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes, you are. Fire
okay.
away.
Just a little commentary first. Katherine, I'm a GP of some 50 years standing and an observational one as well. And I try and uncover the cause of a problem rather than deal with the symptoms. What I believe is happening at the moment with all these gender issues, which I've labeled gender assignment expression spectrum. I can discuss this issue for over 2 hours with you if you should like, because I've been looking at it for the last 7 years or so.
We've got a few seconds, not hours or minutes.
Yeah, I know. I'm getting there. I'm just trying to lay a bit of a background here. Yeah. So the one thing that has astounded me over the last few years is that nobody, and I include the medical profession here, has asked the question why. Why is this happening? I've observed the rapid, steady increase of these gender assignment expression spectrum issues for the last 7 years or so. It's increasing in number. It's having marked sociological and social effects, as we are witnessing and as you've so carefully described. And the commonality...
I think we might accept your question of why it is happening.
No, right. just give me a second, David, please.
A second, yes, but not a speech, please.
All right. Okay. So the commonality here is most of the people with gender dysphoria and gender issues believe that they are born this way. The question is, why are they born this way? And this is what needs to be discussed. So the question is, all right, I'll get back to the question. Why has this not been investigated further? Because there are many toxicological and other environmental issues that can lead to gender expression problems. And
okay, so I think, Joseph, what you're saying is it seems to have exploded in the last few years. So, Katherine, what do you think about that? Why has there all of a sudden been this explosion? Because 10 years ago, nobody even spoke about this.
Well, the people behind this have been working on it for quite some time, getting it into law and policy, changing language, but it's sort of only recently hit the media and actually started manifesting in our institutions. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you transition a child comes to the GP, they says they feel like a boy when they're a girl, instead of asking them the question, why do you feel that way, and exploring that through supportive therapy, but you put them onto a medicalized pathway, they are a profit center for life. So there's a lot of money behind this.
Okay, all right. We'll go to you, Jeff, and then just a reminder to everybody. Look, it's a controversial topic. It's a difficult topic, so please, no speeches and just questions. Thanks, Jeff.
Greetings, Katherine. There is one way for women to be compared with men, and that is in the annals of sport, where Margaret Smith Court Smith is by far the best player of all time. She won 91% of her first-class games, better than Djokovic. She's won more Grand Slams, better than Djokovic. And as far as I can perceive, the pure statistics of her life career would mean that she's won more games against losses than any human alive. That is the way to compare the best of the best. And it's Margaret Smith, a woman, playing against other women, I might add, the obvious. What say you? Did you know that she's won more Grand Slams than anybody else and all the rest?
Yes, yes, she's the greatest of all time with respect to tennis. But had she had to compete against an equivalent male with, age, height, weight, training, she would have been beaten. Even I think it was Venus Williams or Serena Williams said that she knows that she would be ranked 700th, even though she was the best woman in the world. So, that's why we have categories, to make it fair for everybody.
And she's been very unfairly targeted by that community, isn't she? I mean, she's done nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. All she's done is gone to play tennis and done it very well, yet she seems to be the public face of all their anger.
You're not allowed to have divergent opinions anymore. Yeah. That's why.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Arne, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Katherine. I've done a lot of research into this gender ideology, but reading books like Why Gender Matters by Leonard Sachs and The End of Gender by Deborah Souls. I also watched the documentary What is a Woman by Matt Walsh, but just to make it quick, I'll ask 3 questions. First question is, are you familiar with the origin of this gender ideology from Professor John Money and his experiment with the Raymer twins?
Yes.
Second question is, are you familiar with detransitioner or the gender transition, such as Chloe Cole and her interview with Jordan B. Peterson?
Yes, I've spoken to detransitioners, yes. And
the third question is about in regards to women's space, such as prisons. Are you familiar when J.K. Rowling highlighted, I think it was in Scotland, a dude who has this tattoo entering a women's prison, and the early case, I think there was a earlier case of Karen White, I believe, that entered the female prison and sexually assaulted a female. I'm like, what's going on here? So
yes, yeah.
My question, just another question, when did you get red pill in regards to this gender ideology? Because it was in 2019. I'll give you an example. In 2019, I was just training, and then I stumbled across an article on T Nation about the death of women's sports by transgender athletes. That was my first moment when I got aware, like, what's going on here?
Yeah. So when did this really first raise its head, Katherine?
It really hit the zeitgeist in about 2015. However, there have been people working on this for decades, going all the way back to the Yogyakarta Principles, which is a document drawn up by some private individuals, and they're trying to shop it round as a human rights declaration of some sort. They've been getting it in by stealth into law and policy here in Australia, but it's been categorically rejected by the United Nations, and even our Australian Senate rejected it, but they're getting it in at state level. So there are people behind this who've been working on this for years.
Do you think that, I mean, there are people that are detransitioning. Do you think that maybe our side of politics needs to feature them a bit more, maybe with some TV ads, just to present the awfulness of what these people might be going through when they realise they've made a mistake?
Look, I'm aware of people who've actually committed suicide, who've been euthanized, who have died because of complications. And there are quite a growing cohort of people who've been put onto either social, hormonal, or medical or surgical pathway who then regret what has happened to them. And oftentimes they are left with surgical complications that they're not fixable. The rest of their life, their quality of life has been compromised. They are left infertile. They're left with osteoporosis, disabled, all sorts of medical problems. The issue with detransitioners speaking out is often they are very traumatized. And when they say that they're going to detransition, they are often then ostracized and shamed by the LGBTIQ community. So they are often unwilling to speak up, but a few brave souls are bringing litigation. So it's only a matter of time before we see the class actions here or overseas. And
we're seeing so many young people considering transitioning. You know, it's as if your gender is now a spectrum, and you can choose where on the spectrum you choose to lie. But it also makes me think that parents seem to be having a lot less influence on their children than they did perhaps a generation ago. I wonder what you think about that.
Look, I tend to, well, in some ways, I mean, oftentimes the parents might be told about the suicide statistic, which is actually compromised data, that, you know, 1 in 2 trans kids are either going to try to kill themselves or do kill themselves. That data has actually been analysed, and it's compromised. Or you have children that are literally holding their parents, you know, emotionally hostage. And these kids are coming out often out of nowhere, particularly girls, saying that they want to transition. And I'm aware of families in Australia who've actually lost custody of their children to the state for failing to affirm their child medically. So there are really heavy sanctions. So obviously there's those sorts of civil sanctions, also criminal sanctions that are now in law in Victoria. You can be criminally charged if your child is harmed from failing to affirm them. So there's a real cost. It's a real minefield for parents. And I think most parents want to do the right thing, but if they don't have this information about detransitioners, or they haven't heard about all the terrible side effects, that they might be misled by medical practitioners.
Yeah. Okay, Anne, your turn. Please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, Katherine. I'm a big fan of yours. I love you on Sky News. How are we going to restore freedom of speech? While my picture goes crazy there.
Yeah, that's a big one. We seem to be seeing more and more hate speech and vilification laws come into play that are restricting people's ability to speak freely. There are some wins. There was a recent win in New Zealand where they defeated hate speech and vilification laws. So this is where we need to have ordinary people, you know, writing the letters to their MPs, you know, phoning them, ringing up the local radio station, making as much noise as possible. It is going to take a concerted effort by the community to push back.
Okay, thank you. Debbie, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Okay, hey, hi, Katherine. Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. First one is a practical measure with parents wanting to protect their kids from, from all of this from schools. Are you seeing a lot of people, parents pulling their kids out of schools to do homeschooling? And what are your thoughts on that? So that's one. And the other thing is for kids who are confused about their gender at school, the issue of bathrooms and change rooms. What are your thoughts on having separate toilet blocks with for individual bathrooms, for that anyone can use, so that they're not shamed, but just so that they've got a place to go instead of shared group spaces?
Look, a third space is a very reasonable, practical solution. I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I would say the female facilities have to remain for people who are born female and observed female at birth. And then absolutely have a third space. And with respect to education, yes, I am aware there are people who are pulling their kids out of school to do homeschooling, particularly in the United States. But I also hear of stories here in Australia. But because my kids are at just a local public school, they'll be going to a Catholic high school. But I inoculate them against this by always talking about it and just heavily monitoring any media or anything that they're exposed to on the internet. I've taken their iPads away from them, actually. After COVID, they did have iPads. I've taken them away because it's all across like ABC Kids. So you just have to be really involved in your kids' life, sit down at dinner with them every night, talk to them, because they will disclose this stuff, and then you can have a conversation and you can rebut it and also support them if they come up against it at school. And you say to them, well, what do you think about that? And they say, well, that was really silly. And so you encourage them to speak up if they feel confident, or just not say anything if they don't. But parents really need to be vigilant and be really engaged with their children as much as possible.
Katherine, are schools allowed to take a more conservative view on this if they want to, or are they bound by the education departments who set the curriculum?
So in New South Wales, there is a guidance that's been put out that says that if a parent does not affirm child, they can be seen as harmful, and the school can take over the transition process from the parent. That can also happen in Victoria, which is absolutely extraordinary. Whereas I understand, say, with the Catholic schools, they recently put out a guidance at the national level saying that they will not go along with social affirmation. They are not to teach gender fluidity in schools. They took a really hardline approach, but we're still hearing of schools where there might be individual like principals or assistant principals or teachers who are still pushing that. But now people in Catholic schools can make complaints and say, you're not adhering to the guidelines that have come down nationally, and push back. But if you're in a state school, it's a bit different.
Okay, Lorna, your turn, and then we've got a couple of written questions that David will read out. So Lorna, please unmute yourself. Good, fire away.
Good day, Katherine. How are you? Just wanted to say something slightly different. This gender identity is actually being used as a weapon in a lot of countries in order to cause sexual confusion and to weaken a nation's fabric. What's your thought about that? And also, have you heard of Libs of TikTok, and have you watched any of their videos?
Libs of TikTok are fantastic. Yes, I follow them on Twitter. So, yeah, I do see gender identity ideology as an intrusion into family life, into how we tether ourselves to reality. Obviously, we're seeing all these attacks on like mothers, women. Women are being reduced to body parts and bodily processes. And in my view, that's so, we can be exploited, for surrogacy or egg harvesting. We never hear about mothering anymore. It's always about parenting. So I think it is really fundamentally destabilizing. It's tearing families apart. Even amongst adult children, I've had disputes with other adults within my family. I think it is incredibly destructive.
Are you finding that those in favour of all this gender, to these gender issues, are the younger generation? And if so, do you think what do you think will happen when they grow a bit older? Will they grow out of it, or are you a bit worried that maybe they won't?
Well, if you're talking about kids in high school, if you don't socially affirm them and you just say, look, you can identify as whatever you want, but I'm not going to go along with it. I'm not going to go along with your pronouns and so on. The vast majority of children desist. So there is that. But then at the moment, you sort of have the generations that are coming through uni and now, you know, sort of in their 20s and 30s, they've sort of been indoctrinated into it at university. But you've also got a lot of kids who are sick of it. They're sick of all the virtue signaling, how it's taking over the curriculum. It's detracting them from what they actually want to learn. So you do see resistance there. And interestingly, you also have a cohort of sort of older women who do go along with this and who are very much the enforcers, and who will come into certain groups. They came into the Australian Breastfeeding Association and completely derailed that organisation by excluding counsellors who wanted to use the word mother. They actually got disciplined and pretty much thrown out because everyone has to be a gestating parent or a breastfeeder. So you do have people who very much buy into this and are very happy to enforce it and drag others through disciplinary processes and enforce sanctions. So I would call them the Aunt Lydias of the movement, with reference to The Handmaid's Tale. Yeah. Okay, David, if you've got a written question, we can take that now.
I've got two written questions, Katherine. One specific, one a bit more general. The specific one is someone has suggested that the solution to the sports issue should be the creation of a third category. So we have men's, women's, and I guess others.
In between.
Well, whatever. I'm using the term others. There have been some harsher terms floated around as well. What's your view on creating a third category for sporting competitions?
Well, I have absolutely no objection to that. However, they did do that, I believe, for the New York Marathon. They had a non-binary category, and of course it was run by a male. So now they're suggesting maybe we should have female-born non-binary category and a male-born non-binary category. So even when they try to have this third category, it doesn't work. So, but look, I wouldn't object to people putting forward solutions, provided the female category remains dedicated for females only.
Now, the bigger question concerns the role of the medical profession, and there have been a couple of comments and questions that the medical profession has either been weak or complicit, and there is an important principle of primum non nocere, firstly, do no harm. And are we going to see lawsuits against doctors?
They've already started. I'm aware of litigation that is afoot. There is no evidence base for what they're doing to these children. There is no proven efficacy. It's not even an experiment because they don't even have the control group for a lot of this. So they're using medication and surgery inappropriately. And people, as I've said before, are being left with horrible side effects and their lives impaired. And you cannot turn to a 12-year-old child and say, we're going to put you on puberty blockers. Do you understand that you are never going to be able to have children, that you will never have proper sexual functioning? And the 12-year-old, of course, they're going to say, I don't care about that. So the idea that they're saying that they're obtaining informed consent, the idea that they're actually going through years of counselling with these children, that's not true. That is not happening. There are children who are put rapidly fast-tracked onto this medicalised pathway. That's been exposed in the Tavistock. It's being exposed in the US, where they're fighting it state by state, and there are states who are implementing legislation to protect against it. Sadly, here in Australia, we're a bit behind, and we seem to be steaming ahead. But I think as these scandals unfold overseas, they just cannot continue to ignore it.
Yeah. Well, I think there is a political issue that hasn't been picked up, and that's the protection of the children. And that the average person out there, parents would relate to, and I'm looking forward to a political force that will actually pick it up.
Thanks, David. Okay, look, we have come up to time. Katherine, I want to thank you for joining us. It is a difficult topic. I'm actually hopeful that when you say that the kids are just getting sick of all of this, I'm hoping that might be the trigger for some common sense to return. So all I can say is thanks to you. There's a lot of public awareness out there, and I encourage you to do all that you're doing. And I want to thank you for joining us tonight and for sharing your views with us. So thank you so much, and we wish you all the best for the future.
You're very welcome. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Katherine. Just before we go, the L'Chaim program with Maurice Klein is on right now. That's at 3ZZZ at FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. Next week, join us for Joseph Gutnick and his view on the politics of Israel. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what the AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you again next week as usual. Bye from me, and thanks again to Katherine.
Good night.
And I'll just finish with one extra